One of the stories my grandfather used to tell me about was about my great-grandfather Smith. Now, my grandfather Smith was named Quincy Smith, John Quincy Smith, but his father was named Henry Clay Smith, and Henry Clay was quite a well-to-do entrepreneur up in the mountains up there. He helped bring the railroad in. He had a lot of timber interest. He owned a lot of land up there. He owned a lot of the businesses in Oneida, so he had his fingers in about everything. Very well respected. Well, in his later years, oh, by the way, he also had 15 children. He had 9 boys and 6 girls by the same wife, and all lived to adulthood.
That's rare.
Which is very, very unusual back then. But one of the things that he had was he had a home out just a little few miles outside of town. And he was quite a bit older, this is probably the 1930s, early 1930s, maybe the late 1920s, because he died in 1934. But there was another guy whose name escapes me for the second. I'll think of it in a second. Oh yeah, it's Slavin. Now Slavin happens to incidentally be a cousin of mine because he's related to my grandmother Smith. But of course they weren't cousins at the time, they weren't related. But this guy would come by. My grandfather had a dog named Sport. Well, the Slavin character shot my grandfather's dog, killed him. So every time he would, and as the story goes, the way my grandfather, Leland Thomas tells it, is he was kind of a ruffian, just a little bit of a no-good character. Every time he would walk by my grandfather Smith's place, he'd see him and he'd say, "Hello, Sport," just to goad him. Now, Slavin was probably in his late 20s, early 30s. My grandfather had to be in his 60s. So one day, I guess my grandfather had enough of it, and he said, I forgot his first name now. Anyway, he told Slavin, he says, "If you ever call me Sport again, I'll kill you where you stand." Now, back then, up in the mountains, if you said that, you meant it. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a figure of speech. And a couple weeks later, my grandfather was downtown with his youngest daughter on his shoulders, was walking downtown Oneida, and he passed Slavin. Slavin had his daughter, I don't know how old she was, by the hand, and they were walking. As they passed each other, Slavin goes, "Hello, Sport." They both turned and pulled pistols, and my grandfather won the duel. Shot and killed Slavin there on the streets of Oneida. Well, he was charged with the crime of murder and several other crimes, but he was acquitted of murder, and he was fined $50 for discharging a firearm in the city limits. But I guess they figured Slavin deserved it, which he probably did. Well, he was acquitted no matter what it was. Now, the other story about Henry Clay that my grandfather told me, one of the others, which was really cute, was my grandfather was at a funeral. It must have been in the early 1930s. And Henry Clay and his wife Lucinda were there at the funeral. And as the funeral started to break up, Henry Clay asked if he could ever have a ride, him and Lucinda could have a ride back to their house. Because my grandfather at that time was a postman also. Was a postman before he did insurance. And he had a car, one of the few people that have a car. So he said, "Of course, Henry, you can have a car." Well, after the funeral's over, Henry Clay and Lucinda came out to the car, and there's another man sitting in the back. And whoever the guy was, I don't know his name, my grandfather wasn't on friendly terms with him. So he told Leland, he says, "Leland, tell that guy to get out. I ain't riding with him." He says, "No, Henry, I can't do that because he asked me to have a ride before you did. And I can't tell him to get out of the car. He's going to ride too." He said, "Well, if you're going to tell him to get out of the car, I won't ride." So my grandfather says, "Well, Henry, that's your choice." So Lucinda gets to the car and says, "Leland, leave the old fool here. I'm getting to ride home." So he took Lucinda and the other guy home. My grandfather had to walk home. Well, he says the next time, they must have been on a weekend because he said on the next Monday he came by in the mail. And Henry Clay was out by his mailbox, just standing there waiting on him. So my grandfather said, "Oh, this is not going to be good. He's going to be really mad because I made him walk home because it rained on the way home." And so he came by and said, "How you doing, Henry Clay?" He says, "Leland, I just want to talk to you just a bit." He says, "You know, when I walked home, I got totally drenched." He said, "But you did the right thing." That's all he ever said about it. So it was quite a cute story. My grandfather, I told you, had 9 boys. and 6 girls. Well, the 9 boys had their own baseball team with a couple of cousins thrown in. And I've actually got a picture somewhere of them in baseball uniforms. But they actually played and beat the Cincinnati Reds one time. Because back at this time, the Cincinnati, or the baseball leagues, they didn't have, this is probably the 20s, maybe even 1919, somewhere there. They didn't have preseasons like we have. They used to go out and play the small town farm teams or city teams and stuff like that for a preseason. The pros did. And so they wrote them a letter inviting them down to come play, so they came and played them down there in Nevada. And the local boys beat them. Of course, I had one of my uncles, I believe it was great uncle Starr, actually played professional baseball for a little bit. So they were pretty good ball players. They weren't too bad.